For centuries, the name Viking alone was enough to terrify medieval Europe. In monasteries across the continent, scribes recorded their arrival with fear-shaking hands, describing warriors from the northern seas as monsters born of ice and fire, leaving ruined churches and blood-soaked shores behind them. Yet one crucial truth is often overlooked. The Vikings were never a single, unified force. Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes shared gods, language roots, and a mastery of the sea, but they did not fight the same wars, nor did they pursue power in the same way. Each group followed its own path of conquest. They struck different targets, employed different forms of violence, and reshaped conquered lands in distinct ways. Their methods of domination varied as much as their ambitions, and the consequences they left behind were not the same. So the real issue isn't whether the Vikings were ruthless. That is beyond doubt. The real question is which of these three peoples pushed brutality the furthest, leaving wounds so deep that their echoes still resonate through the pages of history today. When we talk about brutality, we're not just counting bodies. True brutality lies in the methodology, the psychological impact, and the lasting trauma inflicted on entire civilizations. The Norwegians, carved out of unforgiving fjords where simply surviving winter was a battle against nature itself, became masters of the lightning raid. They perfected hit-and-run warfare to a terrifying art form. Their attacks came without warning, monasteries burned in minutes, and by the time anyone could mount a defense, the dragon-headed longships were already disappearing over the horizon. For these warriors, combat wasn't merely about conquest or plunder. It was about honor, about proving your worth before the gods, about earning your place in Valhalla where eternal glory awaited those who died with weapons in hand. Killing wasn't just permitted, it was expected, celebrated, woven into the very fabric of what made a man worthy. The Danes saw things differently. Raiding was fine, but why leave when you could stay? They arrived not as temporary threats, but as permanent occupiers, transforming entire societies from the ground up. When the Danes carved out the Danelaw in eastern England, their brutality wasn't limited to battlefield slaughter. It was systemic, institutional, generational. They imposed foreign legal systems on conquered peoples, seized ancestral lands, and methodically erased existing power structures. The Danes understood something that took other conquerors centuries to figure out. Sustained fear is often more effective than spectacular violence. A terrified population will obey without requiring daily massacres, and so they built kingdoms that endured for generations, reshaping the cultural landscape of entire regions. The Swedes took yet another path, and it's the one most people know nothing about. While their Norwegian and Danish cousins were making names for themselves terrorizing Western Europe, the Swedes turned their attention eastward. They descended the great river systems of Eastern Europe like a creeping shadow, deadly but far less theatrical. Known as Varangians in Slavic territories, these Swedish warriors weren't interested in the kind of glory that gets you mentioned in epic poems. They wanted something more tangible, control over the lucrative trade routes connecting Scandinavia with Byzantium and the Islamic world. When local populations resisted, the Varangians eliminated them with chilling efficiency. No battle cries, no dramatic gestures, just the systematic removal of obstacles. Their violence was purely transactional, aimed at economic dominance, but no less devastating for its calculated coldness. To truly understand which of these three groups deserves the title of most brutal, we need to go back to the moment that changed everything. June 8, 793. Norwegian longships materialized off the coast of Lindisfarne, a tiny holy island clinging to the Northumbrian shore. The monks living there had devoted their entire lives to prayer and scholarship. They knew nothing of real violence. When the Vikings came ashore, there were no negotiations, no warnings. Contemporary chronicles describe how raiders slaughtered monks at the very altars where they knelt in prayer, how others were dragged to the beach and drowned in the frigid North Sea waves. Every object of value was stripped away: golden chalices, jewel-encrusted crosses, illuminated manuscripts that took years to create, all either hauled onto ships or tossed into the sea. Some monks were chained and hauled away to be sold as slaves. The monastery burned, and the smoke could be seen for miles. News of Lindisfarne's destruction spread across Christian Europe like wildfire. Alcuin of York, one of the era's most respected scholars, wrote letters expressing absolute horror, questioning what divine punishment could have brought such catastrophe upon God's servants. But Lindisfarne was merely the opening act. The Norwegians had discovered that Western Europe's coastal monasteries and villages were perfect targets, wealthy, defenseless, and completely unable to predict when the next strike would come. For decades afterward, the coasts of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France lived in constant dread. Viking longships, marvels of engineering genius, could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers with equal ease. Raiders could appear miles inland, strike a settlement far from any coast, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. In 845, a fleet of 120 Norwegian ships sailed up the Seine River, and Paris had to pay an enormous silver ransom just to make them leave. While the Norwegians were perfecting the art of the quick strike, the Danes were developing far more ambitious plans. They didn't want just treasure. They wanted land, permanent power, legacy. In 865, a massive Danish force known as the Great Heathen Army landed in England with entirely different intentions. They weren't coming to raid and retreat, they were coming to stay. Over the following years, they systematically conquered kingdom after kingdom. East Anglia fell in 869. King Edmund was captured, and Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe how the Danes tied him to a tree and used him for archery practice until he died riddled with arrows. They cut off his head and displayed it as a warning to anyone considering resistance. Northumbria fell. Mercia fell. Only Wessex, under King Alfred, managed to hold out. That resistance eventually led to a treaty. The agreement at Wedmore in 878 divided England in half. The eastern portion would exist under Danish law, the Danelaw. There, the Danes didn't merely govern, they transformed everything. They established their own courts, their own legal codes, their own property systems. Anglo-Saxon towns were rebuilt according to Scandinavian patterns. York, which they renamed Jorvik, became a thriving Viking city with thousands of Danish inhabitants. The language itself changed, absorbing Norse terms that persist in English today. If you're finding this fascinating, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far across the globe this story is reaching right now. Danish brutality wasn't about spectacular one-night massacres. It was about systematic occupation, the long-term imposition of foreign power over entire populations. Anglo-Saxon families lost lands their ancestors had held for generations. Any resistance was met with public executions. Danish laws treated native populations as second-class citizens in their own homeland. This kind of prolonged domination created a different species of suffering, not the terror of a single raid, but years and decades living under foreign rule that fundamentally redefined cultural identities. While Norwegians and Danes were dominating the West, the Swedes were writing their own conquest story to the East. From the 8th century onward, groups of Swedish warriors and traders began moving down the Volga and Dnieper river systems. Russian chronicles called them Varangians or Rus, a term that would eventually evolve into the name Russia itself. These Varangians didn't encounter wealthy monasteries or organized kingdoms. They found scattered Slavic tribes and, farther south, the vast Byzantine Empire with its legendary riches. The Swedes established fortified trading posts at strategic locations. Novgorod, Kiev became centers of Varangian power. They controlled river routes like highways, moving northern furs, captured slaves, and Baltic amber southward. In return, Byzantine silver, silk, and spices flowed north. The trade generated enormous wealth, but maintaining that control required constant violence. Local tribes that tried to collect tolls or block the rivers were eliminated. The Varangians had no patience for extended negotiations. A village that resisted in spring might wake up massacred by summer. Their methods left no room for second chances. Constantine Porphyrogenitus, a 10th century Byzantine emperor, wrote about the Rus arriving in Constantinople, describing their reputation for ferocity and noting how Byzantine merchants feared them as much as they respected their military capabilities. In 941, Varangian Prince Igor attacked Constantinople with an enormous fleet. The Byzantines deployed Greek fire, that legendary incendiary weapon, to destroy much of the armada. Survivors were captured, and Byzantine chronicles describe mass executions. But Igor returned years later, this time negotiating favorable trade agreements. The Swedes learned that in the east, total conquest was impossible against empires as vast as Byzantium. Instead, they developed a system of calculated intimidation, demonstrations of force followed by advantageous commercial deals. But Swedish brutality manifested most clearly in their treatment of Slavic populations. Slave-taking was systematic, industrial scale. Entire villages could be emptied of their young and healthy, who were then sold in Constantinople markets or to Arab caliphates. A 10th century traveler left detailed descriptions of Rus he encountered along the Volga. He spoke of large, tattooed men who always carried axes and swords. He mentioned funeral ceremonies where a slave woman was sacrificed to accompany a dead chieftain, describing how she was subjected to ritual violence by multiple warriors before being strangled and stabbed, then burned alongside her master's funeral ship. This kind of ritualized violence was common among all Vikings, not just the Swedes. The Old Norse religion demanded sacrifices. Humans and animals were offered to the gods in regular ceremonies. But the Swedes, operating in territories where they remained a permanent minority surrounded by potentially hostile local populations, used these rituals as demonstrations of power as well. A public sacrifice wasn't merely a religious act, it was a warning to anyone considering rebellion. Comparing the brutality of Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes requires understanding that each group operated under different conditions with different objectives. The Norwegians, living in lands where agriculture was difficult and resources scarce, launched themselves at the sea seeking quick wealth. Their attacks were terrifying in their speed and unpredictability. A coastal village in Ireland could wake in peace and be in flames by noon. Survivors told stories of warriors who showed no mercy, who killed without apparent emotion, who vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, taking everything of value. The psychology of Norwegian terror lay in its randomness. Nobody knew when the next attack would come. Months or years might pass, and then suddenly the sails would appear on the horizon. This constant uncertainty kept entire populations in a state of permanent anxiety. Whole settlements were abandoned. Communities moved inland, away from coasts, just to escape the threat. Monasteries that had flourished in peaceful coastal locations had to be fortified or abandoned entirely. The Danes, by establishing themselves permanently in England, created a different type of trauma. Anglo-Saxon families who lost properties lived with the resentment of watching Danish conquerors occupy their ancestral lands. Generations grew up under foreign laws, watching their culture gradually replaced or merged with Scandinavian customs. This kind of occupation generates hatreds that endure for centuries. Then, in the year 1013, England once again fell entirely under Danish domination. King Sweyn Forkbeard launched a successful conquest that brought the whole kingdom under his control. After him, his son Canute the Great expanded that power even further, ruling over England, Denmark, and Norway alike, forging a vast empire that encircled the North Sea. Canute's reign revealed how fully the Danes had learned to blend raw force with calculated statecraft. He eliminated challengers with precision, yet complemented violence with diplomacy. By marrying the widow of the former Anglo-Saxon king, openly embracing Christianity, and portraying himself as the rightful successor rather than an invading outsider, Canute transformed conquest into accepted rule and brutality into political stability. This Danish capacity for adaptation, for transforming violent conquest into stable government, set them apart. They weren't simply destroyers, they were builders who used destruction as an initial tool. Cities under Danish rule often prospered. Trade flourished, but that prosperity was built on foundations of conquering violence, and any challenge to Danish authority was met with renewed brutality. The Swedes, operating across the vast geographies of the East, never achieved the same level of political consolidation the Danes managed in England. Their settlements remained as islands of Scandinavian power in seas of Slavic population. This forced them to maintain constant military presence. They couldn't relax vigilance or show weakness. Swedish brutality was therefore more sustained, less spectacular than a great battle, but more constant than seasonal Norwegian raids. The slave trade the Swedes facilitated represented suffering on a massive scale. Thousands of people captured along Baltic shores, in Slavic territories, among Finnish tribes, were transported south and sold. Families destroyed, entire communities destabilized. All for the economic benefit of Varangian middlemen who controlled the routes. This form of economic brutality, where human suffering becomes a commodity, may be less viscerally shocking than a battlefield massacre, but its effects are equally devastating and far more enduring. In 988, Vladimir the Great, Varangian Prince of Kiev, converted to Orthodox Christianity and forcibly baptized his people. Pagan idols were thrown into the Dnieper, ancient temples destroyed. Kiev's population was driven to the river en masse for baptism. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an imperial command. Those who resisted faced punishment. This mass forced conversion, though it would eventually establish Orthodox Christianity as the dominant religion in the region, was implemented with typical Varangian brutality. Vladimir had personally murdered his brother to seize the throne. He'd captured Polotsk by killing the local prince and taking his daughter by force as a wife. His conversion to Christianity didn't spring from sudden spiritual enlightenment, but from political calculation. He needed an alliance with Byzantium, and Byzantium required conversion. This pattern of pragmatic violence characterized the Swedish presence in the East. Every brutal action had a calculated purpose. They didn't kill for the pleasure of killing or for warrior honor like the Norwegians. They didn't occupy to build lasting empires like the Danes. They killed, dominated, and controlled to maintain lucrative trade flows. And when those flows were threatened, they responded with disproportionate force to ensure the threat wouldn't recur. So we return to the central question: which Vikings were most brutal? The answer depends entirely on how we define brutality. If we measure by immediate psychological impact, by the terror generated in attacked populations, the Norwegians win hands down. Their lightning raids created the archetypal Viking in European imagination, the savage warrior surging from the sea without warning, destroying everything, then vanishing. Medieval chroniclers wrote with trembling hands about men who showed no respect for sacred places, who desecrated churches, who slaughtered defenseless monks. If we measure brutality by lasting impact, by forced transformation of entire societies, the Danes stand out. They didn't just conquer, they reprogrammed entire cultures. The Danelaw in England, which endured for decades, permanently changed the cultural, linguistic, and legal landscape of the region. Town names ending in by and Thorpe still mark areas of Danish settlement a millennium later. This forced cultural transformation, this imposition of external identity on conquered populations, represents brutality exercised not just on bodies but on entire societies. If we measure brutality by cold efficiency, by systematic violence applied with clear economic purpose, the Swedes demonstrate a different but equally chilling cruelty. The slave trade they facilitated moved tens of thousands of people over centuries. Those broken lives, those destroyed families, those annihilated futures, all to feed distant markets. And they did it with minimal spectacle, maximum efficiency. But there's another perspective we need to consider. All three groups shared fundamental cultural elements that made them, from an outside perspective, equally terrifying. All practiced the same pagan religion with its ritual human sacrifices. All valued death in combat as the highest honor. All viewed slavery as normal and economically beneficial. All believed that taking by force what they needed from weaker peoples was natural right, not moral crime. Slave-taking was universal. All groups captured prisoners in battle and sold them or used them as forced labor. Captured women became concubines. Children were separated from families. Slave markets operated in every major Viking city: Dublin, Hedeby, Burka, Kiev. There was no significant moral difference between the three groups in this regard. Slavery was an economic foundation of Viking society, whether Norwegian, Danish, or Swedish. Before we wrap this up, let me know in the comments what rating you'd give this deep dive, 1 to 10. I really want to hear what you thought of this topic. So if they shared so many brutal practices, is there really a significant difference between them? The difference lies in scale, context, and methodology. The Norwegians, limited by hostile geography, conducted intensive but relatively small raids. Fleets of 5 to 20 ships were common, each ship carrying 30 to 60 warriors. They struck fast, took what they could carry, departed. The brutality was intense but brief, concentrated in hours or days. The Danes operated on a different scale. The great heathen army that invaded England numbered in the thousands. They established fortified camps, spent entire winters on enemy territory, planned campaigns lasting years. Their brutality extended through time. A city besieged by Danes might resist for months, watching as attackers systematically cut off supplies, burned surrounding fields, captured and executed groups of defenders to pressure surrender. The Swedes operated across vaster geographies but with smaller numbers. Controlling river routes stretching thousands of miles with hostile populations on both banks required distributed presence. Strategic fortified posts, regular patrols, swift and devastating responses to any challenge. Their brutality was more preventive, designed to discourage resistance before it began. A village that attacked Varangian ships was annihilated completely, left as a warning to other settlements upriver and downriver. By the 11th century, all three groups were transforming. The Christianization of Scandinavia was accelerating. Viking kings, seeing political advantages in aligning with Christian Europe, adopted the new faith. Olaf Tryggvason in Norway, Olaf Skjotkonung in Sweden, Harald Bluetooth in Denmark all converted and pressured their subjects to convert. The classic Viking age was ending. Scandinavian states were consolidating, centralizing power. In 1066, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, invaded England claiming the throne. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Weeks later, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, descended from Vikings who'd settled in France generations earlier, conquered England at Hastings. It was a symbolic ending. Vikings who had settled, civilized themselves, and Christianized were conquering their cousins who still maintained the old ways. But the legacy of Viking brutality persisted in European collective memory for centuries. Stories passed from generation to generation about the men from the north who knew no mercy. Monastic chroniclers, the primary preservers of written history from the era, naturally emphasized violence against Christian institutions. Their accounts shaped historical perception, possibly exaggerating certain aspects while minimizing others. Modern research reveals greater complexity. Vikings weren't just savage warriors. They were sophisticated traders, skilled artisans, brave explorers who reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. They established organized states, developed complex legal codes, created distinctive art. But that complexity doesn't negate the brutality. Both facets coexisted. Comparing brutality among Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes is ultimately an exercise that reveals more about us than about them. Which aspect of brutality we consider worst reflects our own values. Is sudden terror worse than prolonged oppression? Spectacular violence or calculated economic exploitation? Intense but brief suffering or moderate but lasting pain? Every Viking society practiced violence, and each one carved lasting wounds into the regions it reached. Norwegian raiders unleashed sudden, chaotic terror that emptied coastlines and left entire communities erased almost overnight. Danish conquerors imposed long-term domination, reshaping borders, laws, and identities in ways that permanently altered political and cultural landscapes. Swedish warlords exercised a colder form of power, enforcing economic control that transformed human lives into commodities traded for profit. Though their methods differed, their violence was molded by the same forces: harsh environments, strategic opportunity, and relentless ambition. Beneath those differences lay a shared warrior ethos, one that glorified strength, scorned vulnerability, and accepted conquest as a legitimate expression of power. The debate, then, is not about which group was the most savage. It is about how each manifested brutality according to its own realities. And through those choices, all three stamped their presence onto Europe's memory, leaving scars that endured for centuries.